Carbon County, Montana Territory. Winter of 1947. The most respected builder in the valley, a man who'd raised over 60 cabins with his own hands, stood in the snow, staring at what looked like a half-buried metal barrel wrapped in stone. "That," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "is the stupidest thing I've ever seen a man build." The builder didn't argue. He just kept stacking sandstone blocks around the curved steel shell, his breath fogging in the December air. By spring, that stupid building would humiliate 50 years of frontier construction wisdom. Today, you're going to understand why the worst idea in Carbon County became the most copied design in the Beartooth Valley, and why the numbers behind it are still studied by off-grid builders 75 years later. If you want a proven survival technique every single week, methods that worked when lives actually depended on them, subscribe right now and hit that bell. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because this story proves that the coldest places breed the smartest solutions. Let's go back to where it started. His name was Raymond Caulfield. Veteran, mechanic, homesteader, a man who'd survived the Ardennes winter of '44 and figured Montana couldn't be worse. He was wrong. Caulfield settled 12 miles north of Red Lodge in the fall of 1946, on a 160-acre claim with decent water, scattered timber, and a view of the Beartooth Range that made you feel small. He spent October and November throwing up a standard 16 by 20 log cabin, dovetail corners, clay chinking, riverstone fireplace, shake roof. Exactly what every other homesteader in the valley built. It looked right. It felt solid. And when the first cold snap hit in late November, it nearly killed him. The problem wasn't the cold outside. Montana cold was expected. The problem was the cold inside. On a still night with the fireplace roaring, the cabin held maybe 60 degrees near the hearth. 10 feet away, it dropped to 45. By the back wall, your breath frosted. The floor was worse, pulling heat straight out through your boots, no matter how many layers of wool you piled on. And the moment that fire dimmed, even for an hour, the whole structure bled warmth like a sieve. Caulfield did the math. He was burning 6 cords of wood a month. That's roughly 200 pieces of split pine a week just to keep the inside survivable. His neighbors, men who'd been through a dozen Montana winters, told him that was normal. Most families in the valley consumed between 6 and 8 cords per season. Some burned 10, and it got worse. When the wind picked up, the chinking flexed. Cold air found every seam, every gap in the dovetails, every place where the clay had cracked or fallen out. The drafts were so bad, he could watch the candle flames bend. Temperature swings were brutal. 70 degrees by the fire at midnight, 35 degrees by dawn if he let it die down to coals. The moisture was a nightmare, too. Condensation formed on the inside of the logs near the roof. Ice built up on the north wall by February. He stuffed rags into cracks, rechinked with wet clay mixed with ash, hung canvas tarps as inner wind barriers. Nothing fixed it. This was the standard, the method everyone used. 60 years of collective frontier experience, and the best answer was burn more wood, sleep closer to the fire, and wait for spring. Raymond Caulfield had a different idea. In March of 1947, he heard that the Army was auctioning off surplus Quonset huts in Billings, 20-foot-wide half-cylinder steel shelters, used for equipment storage during the war. Most folks saw them as barns, maybe tool sheds. Caulfield saw a frame. He bought one for $40, hauled it back in pieces on a flatbed, and started talking about his plan. A Quonset hut buried halfway into a south-facing hillside, wrapped with 18 inches of stone and thermal mass, heated by a central masonry stove that would turn the whole structure into a radiator. People thought he'd lost his mind. Metal doesn't insulate. Metal conducts. Everyone knew that. Wrap a steel shell around your living space, and you'd be sleeping inside a frozen can. And stone? Stone was for foundations, for fireplaces. You didn't build walls out of it unless you were putting up a fort. It was too heavy, too slow, too expensive. But Caulfield had spent a winter in a Belgian farmhouse during the war. Thick stone walls. Central tile stove. That house stayed warm for hours after the fire went out, even when the temperature outside dropped below zero. He wasn't guessing. He'd felt it. So while his neighbors were rechinked their cabins and split more firewood, Raymond Caulfield started digging into a hillside and building something that looked nothing like a home. Here's what he built. The Quonset hut went up first, anchored on a foundation of stacked stone sunk 3 feet into the hillside. The steel frame formed a 20-foot wide, 32-foot long arch, with the back half buried into the slope for wind protection and thermal stability. The front half stood exposed, facing south to catch winter sun. Then came the controversial part. Caulfield didn't insulate the metal shell. He wrapped it. He built a second wall, an inner wall, 18 to 24 inches inside the steel, using local sandstone and limestone blocks mortared with clay and lime. Not a thin veneer. A full structural wall, running the entire interior curve of the hut, floor to ceiling. That gap between the steel and the stone, he left it open, ventilated. Air could move through, top and bottom, which meant moisture could escape instead of condensing on the metal. The stone wall itself weighed close to 8,000 pounds. Inside that mass, he embedded a central masonry heater, a design he'd sketched from memory, based on the European tile stoves he'd seen. The firebox sat low, vented through a vertical flue that snaked up and around the inside of the stone wall before exiting through the roof. The path was long and intentional. Hot exhaust gases didn't rush straight out. They crawled through channels in the stone, transferring heat to the mass before leaving. This wasn't a fireplace. This was a heat battery. The stone absorbed warmth slowly over hours, then radiated it back into the living space long after the fire burned out. Radiant heat, not convection. It warmed objects and people directly, not just the air. And because the entire inner wall was part of the system, the heat source wasn't a single point. It was a glowing thermal envelope. Caulfield insulated the floor with a sand and gravel base, then laid flat stones on top. The ground temperature below the frost line stayed around 45 to 50 degrees year-round. By using the hillside and thermal mass, he was borrowing stability from the earth itself. Ventilation was crucial. He cut small openings near the base of the stone wall and the top of the steel arch, creating a convection loop. Cold air sank, warm air rose, moisture escaped. No condensation, no rot, no mold. On paper, it made sense. In practice, it looked insane. The metalworkers in Red Lodge told him he was building a sweat lodge. The carpenters said the weight would buckle the frame. The masons, men who'd built half the chimneys in Carbon County, said he was wasting time and money on a design that would crack apart in the first freeze-thaw cycle. And the social judgment was even harsher. "That's not a cabin," one neighbor said, walking past the construction site. "That's a goddamn bunker." Another, "You planning to hide from the Russians, Ray, or just from winter?" The worst came from an older homesteader, a man Caulfield respected. He looked at the stone wall going up and shook his head. "A real man heats with wood and endures the cold. You're building a crutch." Caulfield didn't argue. He kept mortaring stone, one block at a time, packing clay into joints, testing the flue draft, checking his measurements. He knew what people saw. Something ugly, something foreign, something that didn't belong in Montana. But he also knew what they didn't see. Physics. The man who hated it most was named Howard Pitkin, master builder, 62 years old, 34 years of carpentry, masonry, and log work across Montana, Wyoming, and Alberta. If you want a structure that would last, you called Pitkin. He'd built churches, barns, trading posts, and more cabins than he could count. And he thought Raymond Caulfield's stone-wrapped Quonset hut was a disaster waiting to happen. Pitkin didn't keep it quiet. In August of 1947, he showed up at the site while Caulfield was setting the last course of stone along the roofline. He stood there, hands on his hips, watching for a full 5 minutes before he spoke. "You know what that metal shell is going to do when winter hits?" Caulfield looked down from the ladder. "What's that, Howard?" "It's going to sweat. Condensation everywhere. You'll have water running down the inside of that stone wall by December. Mold, rot, ice. Your mortar's going to crack. Your ventilation system, if you can call it that, won't handle the moisture load. You're building a death trap." Caulfield climbed down. "About airflow top and bottom. Convection will move the moisture out." Pitkin shook his head. "Convection theory is fine in a textbook. Real buildings don't work that way. You're gambling with your life, Ray, and I'm telling you, you're going to lose. He didn't stop there. Pitkin went to the lumber supplier in Red Lodge and warned them Caulfield was wasting money on a doomed project. He told other homesteaders the design was dangerous and untested. He even wrote a letter to the county land office questioning whether the structure met basic safety standards for habitation. That thing, he said at the general store one afternoon, is going to cost 3 times what a proper log cabin costs, and it'll last half as long. Mark my words. The criticism wasn't just technical. It was personal. People drove out to see the metal house. They parked on the ridge, pointed, and laughed. Kids called it the tin can. One family passing through joked that Caulfield must have been shell-shocked in the war and couldn't tell a home from a Quonset anymore. Even Caulfield's own brother, visiting from Bozeman, pulled him aside and asked, "Ray, are you sure about this?" There were moments, late nights, alone, with the stone dust settling and the frame creaking in the wind, when Caulfield wondered the same thing. But he'd done the math. He'd checked the physics. He'd lived in stone buildings that held heat, and he'd frozen in log cabins that didn't. The mockery stung, but the numbers didn't lie. So he kept building. By October, the structure was sealed. The masonry heater was cured. The ventilation gaps were in place. The door was hung, a heavy plank affair with a wool-lined frame to cut drafts. The windows were small, south-facing, shuttered. It didn't look like any cabin in Montana. And when the first snow fell in early November, Howard Pitkin told half the valley that Raymond Caulfield wouldn't make it to Christmas. January 1948. The cold came down from Canada like a hammer. It started on January 9th, clear skies, no wind, and the temperature dropping fast. By evening, it was 5 below zero. By midnight, 15 below. By dawn, the thermometers in Red Lodge read minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. And it stayed there. For 12 straight days, the Beartooth Valley sat under an Arctic air mass that pushed nighttime temperatures down to minus 30, minus 35. During the day, if the sun broke through, it might climb to minus 10. That was the warmth. Wind chills hit minus 50. Snow fell intermittently, but the real killer was the cold itself, dry, still, relentless. The kind of cold that froze the moisture in your nostrils, made your lungs ache, turned exposed skin white in under a minute. And it isolated everyone. Roads drifted shut. Livestock huddled in barns. Families stayed inside, burning wood, rationing movement, trying to outlast it. In the log cabins scattered across the valley, the struggle was immediate. Fires had to stay lit around the clock. Even then, the heat didn't spread. Families slept in the main room, abandoning bedrooms because they were uninhabitable. Ice formed on the inside of north-facing walls. Condensation froze on window panes, sealing them shut. Floors were so cold that people wore double socks and still felt the ache in their feet. Firewood consumption spiked. Men went out in the brutal cold to haul logs from sheds, only to find the wood half frozen and slow to catch. Greenwood smoked. Drywood burned fast. Families that thought they had enough fuel started rationing. Some burned furniture. Some burned fence posts. One family 3 miles south of Caulfield's place ran out entirely and had to move in with neighbors. By day 6, people were desperate, and that's when they started noticing something strange. Caulfield's place, the stone-wrapped Quonset hut everyone had mocked, wasn't smoking. Or rather, it was smoking, but only for a few hours in the morning and evening. The rest of the day, the chimney sat quiet. No constant plume. No frantic stoking. A neighbor, bundled in wool and fur, trudged through the snow one afternoon to check on him, half expecting to find Caulfield frozen inside. He found him splitting kindling outside the door in shirt sleeves. "You all right, Ray?" Caulfield looked up. "Yeah, you." The neighbor stared. "It's 18 below. You're not even wearing a coat." Caulfield grinned. Stepped out for 2 minutes. "It's 70 inside." The neighbor didn't believe him. Couldn't believe him. 70 degrees? In this cold? That was impossible. "Come see for yourself," Caulfield said. The man followed him through the door and stopped cold. The interior of the Quonset hut was warm. Not fire warm, where you had to stand next to the hearth to feel it. Warm everywhere. The stone walls radiated heat like a living thing. The floor was warm underfoot. The air was still dry, comfortable. The neighbor pulled off his glove and touched the stone wall. It was hot, not surface hot from a nearby flame. Deep, sustained, radiating hot. "How much wood are you burning?" he asked. Caulfield shrugged. "One fire in the morning. One in the evening. Maybe 2 hours each. That's it." The man looked at the small pile of firewood stacked near the masonry heater. It was nothing, a fraction of what his own family was burning through daily. "You're telling me this place stays 70 degrees on 4 hours of fire a day?" "Higher, actually," Caulfield said. "Hasn't dropped below 65, even overnight." The neighbor went home, told his wife, and within 2 days, half a dozen people had made the trek through the snow to see it for themselves. And what they saw changed everything. Stay with me, because the numbers that came out of that January cold snap humiliated 50 years of frontier building wisdom and proved that sometimes the craziest idea is just physics waiting to be believed. On January 15th, 1948, a man named Gerald Hutchins showed up at Raymond Caulfield's door carrying a mercury thermometer and a notebook. Hutchins was a surveyor, methodical, precise, and deeply skeptical. He'd heard the rumors about Caulfield's warm metal house and didn't believe a word of it. So he walked 2 miles through knee-deep snow in minus 28-degree cold to prove everyone wrong. What he found instead was a number he couldn't argue with: 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Hutchins stood in the center of the Quonset hut, holding the thermometer at chest height, watching the mercury settle. He walked to the back wall, 66 degrees. The corner near the door, 64. The sleeping area along the north curve, 65. Outside, the temperature was minus 26. That's a 94-degree difference. Hutchins put his hand against the stone wall. It was warm to the touch, not surface heat from a nearby flame, but deep, sustained warmth radiating outward. He checked the masonry heater. The firebox was nearly cold. Caulfield had let it burn down to ash 2 hours earlier. "When did you last stoke this?" Hutchins asked. "Around dawn," Caulfield said. "Maybe 6 o'clock. It was nearly 10 in the morning. For hours since the fire had gone out, and the interior temperature had dropped less than 5 degrees. Hutchins wrote it all down. Then he did something that changed the conversation in the valley. He walked to 3 neighboring cabins, all within a mile, all built with standard log construction, and measured their interior temperatures at the same time of day, under the same weather conditions. The results were brutal. Cabin 1, 47 degrees, with a fire actively burning in the hearth. Cabin 2, 52 degrees, fire roaring, family huddled near the flames. Cabin 3, 43 degrees, fire just stoked an hour prior. Caulfield's stone-wrapped Quonset hut was 20 degrees warmer than the hottest log cabin in the area, and his fire had been out for hours. But temperature wasn't the only measurement that mattered. Firewood consumption told the bigger story. By the end of January, Caulfield had burned through roughly 1.5 cords of wood. His neighbors, the ones who made it through without running out, had consumed between 6 and 8 cords. Some had burned more. That's a fuel efficiency difference of 4 to 5 times. Caulfield was heating the same square footage in the same cold with 20% of the wood, and his interior temperature was higher, more stable, and more evenly distributed. The physics were undeniable. The stone mass, 8,000 pounds of sandstone and limestone, was acting exactly like a thermal battery. It absorbed heat slowly during the 2-hour burns, then radiated that heat back into the space for the next 10 to 12 hours. Radiant heat transfer, not convection. The warmth didn't rise and pool at the ceiling. It spread evenly, warming surfaces, objects, and bodies directly. The metal shell, far from being a liability, was actually an asset. It blocked wind completely. No drafts, no air infiltration. The ventilation system Caulfield had built, those small openings top and bottom, created a passive convection loop that moved moisture out without losing heat. The interior stayed bone dry. No condensation, no ice on the walls, no mold. The floor was warm, too. Hutchins measured it at 58 degrees, 15 to 20 degrees warmer than the frozen plank floors in neighboring log cabins. That difference came from 2 sources: the radiant heat from the stone walls warming the floor surface, and the thermal stability of the earth itself beneath the foundation. When Caulfield fired the masonry heater, the heat didn't vanish up the chimney. It moved through the flue channels embedded in the stone, transferring energy to the mass before exhausting. The exhaust gases left the building at a much lower temperature than a standard fireplace, meaning more of the heat stayed inside, stored in the stone, instead of escaping into the sky. It was efficient, it was elegant, and it was irrefutable. Word spread fast. Within a week, a dozen homesteaders had visited to see it for themselves. They touched the walls. They measured the air. They asked questions about the firebox, the flue design, the ventilation, the stone types, the mortar mix. And then Howard Pitkin showed up, the master builder who'd called the design a death trap, who'd warned the valley that Caulfield was building a failure, who'd staked his reputation on the fact that metal and stone couldn't work together. He walked in, thermometer in hand, and stood silent for 5 full minutes. Then he said, "I need to see your plans." Caulfield pulled out the sketches, rough drawings on butcher paper, measurements scribbled in the margins, notes about flue paths and airflow. Pitkin studied them. He walked the perimeter of the stone wall, checking the mortar joints, the ventilation gaps, the anchoring. He knelt by the masonry heater and traced the flue path with his finger. Finally, he stood up, looked Caulfield in the eye, and said, "I've been building for 34 years. I was wrong." It was the most important sentence spoken that winter, because when Howard Pitkin admitted he was wrong, the entire valley listened. By the spring of 1948, the conversation in Carbon County had shifted. Raymond Caulfield's stone-wrapped Quonset hut wasn't a joke anymore. It was a case study. Howard Pitkin didn't just admit he was wrong. He asked to borrow Caulfield's plans. He wanted to understand the thermal dynamics, the airflow, the reasoning behind the flue design. He spent 2 afternoons at the site, measuring, sketching, asking questions. And then he started talking. At the lumber supplier in Red Lodge, Pitkin told people what he'd seen. At the general store, he described the numbers. When homesteaders asked him about winter construction, he mentioned Caulfield's design as a serious option. Not a gimmick, not an experiment, but a functional solution to a problem everyone faced. The adoption wasn't instant. It was organic. By the winter of 1949, a homesteader named Carl Brunner built a half-buried stone structure on the east side of the valley, using a salvaged Quonset frame and local river rock. He didn't copy Caulfield's design exactly. He modified it, using a simpler heater and thicker walls. It worked. In 1950, 2 more families followed. One used a stone and clay hybrid. Another built a partial stone wall on the north side of a traditional cabin, turning it into a heat sink. Both reported lower wood consumption and warmer interiors. By 1952, there were 11 structures within 40 miles that incorporated some version of Caulfield's principles: stone thermal mass, radiant heat storage, central masonry heaters, wind-protected shells. The design variations were fascinating. Some homesteaders couldn't afford a Quonset hut, so they built stone walls inside traditional log cabins, creating a thermal core. Others used the hillside burial technique without the metal shell, relying on earth berming for wind protection. A few built standalone masonry heaters and surrounded them with stacked stone benches that doubled as sleeping platforms, an old European idea brought back to life in Montana. The principle was the same: store heat in mass, radiate it slowly, reduce fuel consumption. It wasn't about copying Caulfield. It was about understanding what he understood. And what he understood was this: the metal shell wasn't the enemy. It was a windbreak, a structural frame, a moisture barrier when properly vented. The stone wasn't decorative. It was a battery, a way to capture heat and release it over time, smoothing out the brutal temperature swings that made frontier winters so deadly. The masonry heater wasn't a luxury. It was an efficient transfer system, pulling energy out of combustion and locking it into mass instead of sending it up the chimney. None of this was magic. It was physics. Thermal mass absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly. Radiant heat warms objects and people directly, not just air. Convection moves air, and with it, moisture. Proper ventilation prevents condensation. Insulation slows heat loss, but mass stores it. Caulfield hadn't invented these principles. He just applied them in a place where everyone else had assumed they didn't matter. The cultural shift was quieter, but just as significant. For decades, the standard answer to cold had been, burn more wood, build thicker walls, suffer through it. Caulfield showed that you could work smarter, not harder. You could use the earth, the sun, the materials at hand, and the basic laws of thermodynamics to create comfort with less effort. People stopped calling him stubborn. They started calling him practical. And Howard Pitkin, the man who'd fought the design the hardest, became one of its most vocal advocates. He told younger builders to study heat flow, to think about thermal mass, to stop assuming that the old way was the only way. I built 60 cabins the same way for 30 years, he said once, standing outside Caulfield's hut in the spring of 1950. And every single one of them was colder than this. The legacy didn't end in Montana. Caulfield's design, stone-wrapped Quonset huts, earth-bermed shelters, masonry heaters with embedded thermal mass, spread slowly through off-grid communities across the Rockies. Some variations made it into Alaska. Others showed up in the Dakotas, the Northern Plains, even parts of Canada. And today, 75 years later, the principles are still studied. Modern passive solar homes use thermal mass floors and walls to store heat. Rocket mass heaters and masonry stoves are staples of the homesteading movement. Earth-sheltered buildings, buried into hillsides for temperature stability, are recognized as some of the most energy-efficient structures you can build. Raymond Caulfield didn't invent any of that, but he proved it worked when it mattered most. He proved that the best survival wisdom isn't always traditional or modern. It's just physics applied with intention. He proved that sometimes the craziest idea is the one nobody's tested yet. And he proved that a man in shirt sleeves, standing outside in 18 below weather, can teach you more about heat than 1,000 arguments ever will. So here's the question I'll leave you with. Which part of this solution would you apply to your own home today? Would you add thermal mass to your heating system? Would you use radiant heat instead of forced air? Would you bury part of your structure into a hillside for wind protection and temperature stability? Drop a comment below and let me know. And while you're at it, tell me where you're watching from and what's the coldest winter you've ever faced. Because I guarantee someone in this community has a story that'll teach the rest of us something. If this kind of real, tested, historical survival knowledge is what you're here for, make sure you're subscribed. Hit that bell, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay warm. Educational note. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.